Welcome to Strategic Thought. This is the first lecture of the semester, and it asks the basic question, what is strategic thought? Everybody thinks they can do it, yet few can really do it if you look at history. So what is it, and why is it different than other types of thinking? Well, I'll get right to the point. Strategic thought is critical thought. Strategic thinking is critical thinking, and we're going to hone those skills today. Failure to think strategically often leads to failure in war. I'll give you just a tactical example to start off the course.
Moss Eisley Spaceport. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
How long have you had these droids?
About 3 or 4 seasons.
They're up for sale if you want them.
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business.
You can go about your business.
Move along.
Move along. Move along.
So our first strategic failure alert is don't be a mindless stormtrooper. Always think critically about your situation and think creatively about it. Often it's only in the hindsight of history that we realize the mistakes that were made. Don't be a mindless stormtrooper. Now let's bring a second example. Let's bring it back down to earth into more of a strategic context. You've perhaps heard of this saying, generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. Well, this truism happens to be true. I mean, obviously not all generals, not all times, but generally, to use a bad pun, a lot of strategic thinkers think about the last war rather than the one they need to fight. For an example, let's get in our time machine and go back around 100 years to this war, World War I, one of the worst and bloodiest wars in history. Now, when it was concluded during the Treaty of Versailles, Clemenceau, the gentleman there with the big white bushy mustache, he fell into this trap, as did his generals. They thought the future of war that they had just won would look just like the next war, but with better technology. So what did they do? What did they invest all their money into? What was their super weapon? The Maginot Line. One of the most formidable and arguably the strongest defense fortification system ever made in human history. And they thought that World War II would look just like World War I, trench warfare, static defense, attrition, and that they would be prepared and stop Germany at their border with the Maginot Line. Here's the Maginot Line. Perhaps some of you have even visited it. Now, we all know how this story ended. While France stood stagnant in its strategic thinking, Germany evolved, they adapted, and they created a new way of warfare called the Blitzkrieg that revealed new types of strategic thinking, and the technology then followed from that. And they easily outflanked the Maginot Line, and what they could not achieve in 4 bloody years of World War I, they achieved in just 46 days of World War II. They captured France. They were driving panzers down Parisian boulevards and around the Arc de Triomphe. They did this because they changed their strategic thinking. Not because they had more money or resources or weapons than France. They did not during the interwar years. But they adapted and upgraded their strategic IQ. In fact, when it was happening, when panzers were coming down and descending on Paris, the French High Command still was bewildered about how it could possibly happen. As one eyewitness said, our leaders were incapable of thinking in terms of new war. Their minds were too inelastic. They could not do strategic thinking, even as it was happening to them. And we see this problem today amongst our leadership across the globe today, especially in the West. This is what many war futurists see. If you go to think tank events or you look at portrayals of future war in novels or in movies, you have people who think they're looking forward into the future, but they're really looking in the rear view mirror. And what does that look like? What's our last successful war in the United States of America? It's World War II. And this remains the paradigm of warfare for the United States of America, the national security establishment, Washington, D.C., the Pentagon, Congress. They think, for example, many people, not everybody, they think that in an era of great power competition, many assume that a war with China and or Russia will be ultimately a conventional one, a conventional fight. And maybe it will, but maybe it won't. Future wars may not be conventional. Future wars often do not look like the last successful one. So are we preparing for a conventional fight when conventional war may be obsolete? I'll leave you to think about that during this course. And this leads to our second strategic failure alert, the Maginot mentality, assuming future wars will look like past successful ones, but with better technologies. And you hear this around DC today. People think that a future war with China might look like the Battle of Midway in the South China Sea, but with Ford-class carriers and F-35s. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Now, true war prophets do exist, people who accurately see the future of war, but they are rarely believed in history. This is an interesting phenomenon. It's called Cassandra's curse. Now, Cassandra, some of you may remember from your ancient Greek theology or stories. She was the princess in Homer's Iliad from Troy, and she saw the future. The gods gave her the gift of prophecy, but the curse that no one would believe her. And those who see the future of war often suffer from Cassandra's curse. They see the future, but rarely are they believed until it's much too late. We'll go back, for an example, back to the same war, World War I. Billy Mitchell. Now, Billy Mitchell was a U.S. Army aviator who fought in World War I. And when he came back to Washington as a one-star, he told everybody what he saw. He says the future of war will be air power, and we must start getting ready now. Now, he was laughed off the stage by his peers. They all told Billy, sit down, shut up, be quiet. We all know the future of war will look like the last successful one that we won. Straight leg infantry, defense, static line attrition, the rifle, the machine gun. But he said, no, they said, look at the Maginot Line. He said, no, that's all wrong. Then he said something that was heretical. He said, in the future, the airplane can sink battleships. Now, when Billy Mitchell said this in 1920, the airplane was little more than a motorized kite in the era of the super dreadnought. Well, his peers howled at him, and so did people beyond the War Department as it was then. But Billy had some grit, and he had some wasta, and he convinced the Department of Navy to pull out some captured German battleships from World War I into the Chesapeake Bay, where he did this. He sank them. He sank them with airplanes. Now, do you think that this spurred a revolutionary of strategic thinking in the U.S. War Department? No, it did not. In fact, all it did was people clung and dug in deeper to their camp. So conventional warriors and all the conventional admirals and generals, they said, forget it, Mitchell. That was just a publicity stunt that doesn't simulate real wartime conditions. That proves nothing. And Mitchell said, no. It proves that airplanes can sink battleships. It's proof of concept. Let's go from there. And this debate got so acrimonious that spilled over into national media headlines, into congressional politics. And here's an example from the Chicago Tribune. On the top, it shows, the Navy's saying, hey, that proves nothing. And then it shows Mitchell in the bottle saying, no, it does. We sank it, didn't we? That's exactly what we said we'd do. And this got so acrimonious and so nasty that General Pershing, who was then sort of like the CGSC of the War Department, perhaps to save Mitchell's career, pulled Mitchell aside and said, Mitchell, Billy, we need you to get out of town just for a little while until this debate subsides. And so in true military fashion, they assigned Mitchell a 1-year tour in the Pacific, the other side of the planet, just to get him out of Washington, D.C. And he disappears for a while. He comes back a year later, holding a report 2 inches thick. In this 2-inch thick report, he says that Japan will launch a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor with airplanes and sink battleships. And this will suck the U.S. and Japan into a total war of the Pacific that will determine who controls the Pacific. He predicted Pearl Harbor. He did this in 1924. Right? Now, what happens to Billy Mitchell after this? Do you think that, they look at this 1 star and take it seriously and maybe the commander of Hawaii should look at this? Do they do that? No. They court-martial him. They court-martial Mitchell for insubordination. And this isn't just any court-martial. It's a Kim Kardashian court-martial with paparazzi and fake witnesses and judges who are thrown out for corruption. And none of the jury had any aviation experience. And this court-martial occurred at Fort Leslie McNair. And it was the media and all sorts of stuff. And at the end of the day, the jury of officers deliberated for 30 minutes and found him guilty. And Mitchell stripped off his uniform in disgust and says, I'm out of here. I am done. And he spends the last 5 years of his life bitter, going across the country, talking to anybody who'd listen to him, saying the future of war is air power. The future of war is air power. Nobody took him seriously. People would show up just to listen to the old kook, but nobody took him seriously. He died a bitter man and refused to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. He's now buried in Milwaukee, his hometown. And we know how this story ends, don't we? Pearl Harbor happened, and the military said it was caught completely by surprise, even though one of its own generals was standing on desks 20 years earlier, predicting with a remarkable foresight that this moment would happen. Now, how did this come to pass? Here we have somebody with a strategic vision for the future, engaging in real strategic thought, and he is dismissed as a quack. Well, the short answer is this: culture eats strategy for breakfast, a saying by business management expert Peter Drucker. The culture that Mitchell was bumping up against was this: that of 400 years of military history, where, the battleship in the Navy, for example, that was the king of the sea, that controlled the sea. Countries measured their worth, their great powerness, if you will, by how many capital ships they owned, how many battleships. If you want to be a 4-star admiral in any navy, you did all of your time serving and ultimately captaining a battleship. That was the surest way to reach to the stars. And here comes Billy Mitchell, 1920, and he says, no, the battleship's actually obsolete, and it's the aircraft carrier that will reign the future as king of the seas. And people thought that was ludicrous. I mean, think of all the 4-star generals of every navy up to this point saying, like, I did all my 40 years in uniform on battleships. You're telling me this new thing, this flat top called a carrier, is going to take over this sea? That's ridiculous. The battleship was actually already obsolete in World War II. But conventional warriors who could not think strategically, it took the Battle of Midway to prove it to themselves that carriers were the king of the sea. Because arguably the most substantial strategic naval battle of the 20th century was the Battle of Midway. And never did the two fleets see each other. Never did the Japanese fleet or the American fleet see each other. They fought it completely by naval aviation, as Mitchell had predicted. And after the war was fought, the battleship quietly went away, because only then did the doubting Thomases understand that the battleship was obsolete. And it was replaced by carriers. In fact, nobody bought battleships anymore. Now the carrier is the king of the sea. And this is Billy Mitchell's legacy. Now, the military did not apologize, not really, during the war, but they did in their own way make up to him and named a bomber after Mitchell, the B-25 Mitchell bomber. So here's another strategic lesson. In your organization, wherever that might be, find and protect your Cassandras. Because we have to ask ourselves today, are we facing a Billy Mitchell moment today? And that's true whether you're in the military or the State Department or the intelligence community or you're from another nation. Find and protect your Cassandras and distinguish real Cassandras who have strategic vision from the knee-jerk Cassandras who are spitting out the latest fad and fashion of strategic thinking, right? So find and protect your Cassandras. And maybe some of you will be Cassandras too. That would be wonderful. So the only way we can distinguish who's a Cassandra from who's a charlatan is using strategic thought. It's not just to figure out how to win a war, it's also to identify your strategic thinkers to help you do that. And for this, we need to think a little bit about thinking. So let me ask you this question. What's the difference between something that is complicated versus something that is complex? The difference between something is complicated versus complex. Something that is complicated is something like a circuit board, or like an airplane, the F-35 or the Boeing 747. It is without doubt one of the most complicated machines ever conceived of and built by human minds. You could take it apart and put it back together and in theory fly it again. So it requires a certain type of genius to create this thing, a complicated genius, but it's a type of thinking. It's like science, scientific thinking. And here are the main attributes of complicated thinking. They're proportional. So small inputs equal small outputs. It's replicable, like an experiment in science is replicable. It's additive, where the sum equals its parts. It's not greater than the parts. The sum equals its parts. And cause and effect is key. Cause and effect is key. Things that are complicated are things, again, like building a 747. To create and design and build one and fly it is example of complicated thinking. So this is an example. Things that are complicated, like 747s, they have linear complexity because it is logical, it is predictable, and most importantly, it is solvable. You can take apart that 747 and rebuild it and it should fly. Yet it's very complex. It has a million parts to it. It's not an easy thing to make or put together or fix. So we call that structural complexity. It has multiple interacting parts that are very complicated, right? But complicated problems can be reverse engineered. Solutions can be derived from a checklist, right? A checklist. So these things are complicated. There are other things in human phenomenon that are complex. For example, a family. The way a family interacts is complex. Or the way a parliament or a legislative body or Congress interact is complex. You can't reverse engineer U.S. Congress, right? You can't solve for X to determine what the Senate what kind of laws they'll pass in 2021. It's not possible. These are complex problems, not complicated ones. And it's more like art. They are not proportional. They are not replicable, they're not additive, and cause and effect may not matter, okay? So we call this nonlinear complexity because it's not logical, it's not predictable, it's not solvable. It also has interactive complexity, not structural complexity like a 747, which has 100 million parts. It's interactive. Like you might have, 100 senators, but how they will interact are all 100 independent variables, and so we don't know, and that's called interactive complexity. Okay. So complex problems cannot be reverse engineered. Solutions cannot be derived from a checklist, right? Different type of problem. Now, strategy is an art. It's never a science. Strategic problems at the strategic level are complex problems, not complicated problems. Both types of thinking are important. Both types of thinking require a certain type of genius. The genius that's required to unravel or to think through strategic problems, strategic thought, is complex thinking, right? So strategy is an art and never a science. So the most complex problems are sometimes called wicked problems. Wicked problems are a type of complex problems that are so unstructured, they are so complex that they are become intractable because of these three features. They are difficult to define. Experts disagree on the nature of the problem. Think of global warming, for example. There's no clear solution. What should we do about it? Again, experts and everybody else disagrees. And here's the kicker, the third one, is that you may stumble upon the solution, but not know it for 50 years, not know it for a generation, right? So these are wicked problems. Climate change is an example of wicked problems. The global economy is an example of a wicked problem. And so are national security problems. National security problems at the strategic level of war, at the highest level of war, they are all almost always wicked problems. Here's an example. This is somebody trying to lay out Afghanistan during the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, and they're trying, admirably yet feebly to lay out all the complexity of politics in Afghanistan. And of course, they don't come close, right? I mean, what do these arrows mean? Do they show a causal relationship? Do they show an independent variable relationship? It's all kind of nonsense. And as General McChrystal, the commander at the time, said, when we understand that slide, we'll have won the war, he quipped. So wicked problems cannot be reverse engineered. Solutions cannot be derived through checklists and flowcharts. This is why doctrine and field manuals do not really apply to strategic level problems. We have to learn how to think through complexity. And this requires critical thinking. How do you think about ambiguity? How do you think about complexity when you have multiple you have a wicked problem on your hands? And so those who try to engineer a solution will always fail. And this is why formulaic approaches to strategy fail. There is no checklist for victory. Anybody who tells you otherwise, you should disbelief. There's no checklist, just like there's no checklist for Congress. There's no checklist for a happy family. There's no formulaic approach to victory in war or peace. And this is what you have to become. You have to stop thinking like an engineer and start thinking like an artist. And that's what war artists are. They're strategic thinkers. They can improvise with the jazz of war and international relations, of war and peace, right? That's what you need. You need somebody who can improvise along with wicked problems and not try to solve them as if it's a science experiment. So strategic thinking is critical thinking like art for complex problems, not science for complicated problems. Science is a different type of genius. It's just not the right type of genius for strategic thinking. Now let's think about the relationship between complexity and the three levels of war. Many of you will already know that war has three levels. It has the tactical level sort of at the bottom. This is the point of view of the individual soldier in the, or individual fighter of the human perspective. This is often what Hollywood focuses on, the tactical level, or military histories or biographies. It's a tactical level of war. It's what's going on the ground, in the air. There's the operational level, and this is like a theater of war. And this is sort of linking multiple tactical campaigns together. So, the operational level of war in World War II, for the Americans and the Brits and the Allies, it was to seize Berlin, right? Now, there's another theater of war in the Pacific, right? That's separate and distinct. And the strategic level of war, this is the big picture, as they say. This could be the globe. This could be a region, right? If you're a country in say, for like Nigeria in Western Africa, it could be your region. You want to become maybe a hegemon of Western Africa. And now here's the connection between complexity and the three levels of war. The closer you get to the ground at the tactical level, it becomes like a complicated problem. These are puzzles, but they're well structured. They're complicated puzzles. Then the more you go up into the strategic level, it becomes more of a wicked problem. So if you're at the National Security Council, you're dealing wicked problems the way you're not doing it if you're doing if you're a littoral combat ship, right? Or you're for an F-35, if you're a battalion commander on the ground. So again, there's a relationship between the three levels of war and complexity and the type of thinking needed. And we see this. If you're if you've gone to, say, Ranger School and you're an infantry officer, you're dealing with tactical problems. Now, look at this, like an ambush. Now, there's no two ambushes in the world are the same, but they are very similar. And you can derive sort of best practices about how to conduct a linear ambush. And this is an example of tactical thinking, which is sort of like engineering. It's you're dealing with a complicated problem that has linear and structural complexity. It doesn't make it easy, but it requires a different type of thinking than, say, this. The Yalta Conference in 1945, right? This is a complex problem that requires complex thinking and not complicated thinking. It has nonlinear and interactive complexity. I mean, think of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Those are three independent variables. And solutions here cannot be engineered. We don't know what Stalin's going to do, what Russia's going to do. It requires critical thinking and strategic thinking. So they're different, right? And they require different types of thinking and different types of preparation. So tactics, you can learn tactics through training, like Ranger School for the 11 Bravos out there. Or you can, but for strategic level thinking, you need education, critical thinking, and you do that traditionally in universities and other places as well. Now, one of the biggest reasons for strategic failure is that people try to engage in tactical thinking at the strategic level, and this will fail. And think about it. To become, say, a U.S. Army officer, the first 8 to 10 years of your life, you have to be a proficient tactical thinker, right? You have to show promise at the tactical level of war. And when do people get to go to get a strategic level of war? When do we actually start asking people to think strategically? Well, it's in War College. They've got 15 to 22 years of service already in. Why do we wait that long? Let's do strategic level thinking when people are midshipmen or when they're cadets or when they're, at NCO academy. Why do we wait so long? And this produces tactical thinkers at the strategic level. And then we wonder why, Afghanistan is one of the longest wars in U.S. history. So the challenge of strategic thought is that you think bigger. You think bigger. So this is an example of not thinking big enough, right? Don't let this be you. This is what tactical thinkers do at the strategic level. So how do we not let this be you? That's what we're going to discuss next. Einstein once said, if he was given 1 hour to save the planet, he would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. What do you think he means by this? What do you think he means? 59 minutes just thinking about the problem and 1 minute coming up with the answer? Well, Einstein was no dummy, as you all know. What he meant is this. How we perceive the question can sometimes predetermine the answer. Have you seen this in your career where a young lieutenant or somebody else jumps too quickly to a solution without thinking through the problem, and that results in problems, serial problems later on down the line? That's what he means. He means question your assumptions, understand the nature of the problem. And this is what critical thinking is all about. It's a different type of thinking than engineering thinking. They have some similarities. Their Venn diagrams do intersect. But I want you to think purely now as a critical thinker. Don't fall for stupid Jedi mind tricks. Don't refight the last war. So this is what he's talking about, critical thinking. Now, it really is another way of asking, how do we know what we know? In philosophy, this is called epistemology, asking this question, how do we know what we know? In psychology, it's called cognitive theory. There are many definitions for it, but ironically, giving you a definition kind of defeats the purpose of critical thinking. But if you want, there's some definitions in the reading. So how do we know what we know? This is essential to threat assessment. And we could spend a whole semester on this, but we're not. So how do we know what we know? So think of it this way. Here's you, and here's the world. We just look at the world and understand it. Do you think that is correct? Yes or no? Just answer in your mind. Do you think that's what goes on? We see the world, or our sensors see it, and we internalize it, and we get it. Well, not exactly. Actually, the world is so complex, it would overwhelm our brains, our tiny little mammalian brains. So, it's too complex for us mortals to comprehend. I mean, just think about it in our daily lives and family and who you know and friends and stuff like that, right? So as we grow up, as we go from infancy to adulthood and beyond, we develop little shortcuts to comprehend the world. Think of it like a microprocessor that allows us to simplify complex situations. And we do it now by rote. So for example, just think on a commute. Have you ever had this experience where you drive from your house to your workplace and you don't remember anything in the drive? You're just sort of on autopilot the entire time. That's because you have heuristics have taken over. And what heuristics means is that these are like shortcuts that your brain automatically processes and says, for this complicated thing of a red light versus green light, we create a heuristic. Red light means stop, green light means go. And we can have so many heuristics that we can drive an autopilot safely and navigate from our house to our place of work and do it day in and day out. And it's what people do. This is an example of a heuristic that your brain knows that the difference between a red light and a traffic light and a red neon stop sign that's saying diner is open is one means stop your car, the other means you can go eat and the diner is open. So heuristics are kind of what dictate how we live in many ways. And it's not just for driving, it's for everything. Think of it as a lens, okay? It's like a lens that allows a worldview, right? And it helps you reduce and simplify the complex nature of the world into bite-sized bits that our brain can understand. Some people call this a worldview, a paradigm, a framework, an ontology, a dominant logic in the business world. We'll just call it a frame. That means they're relatively synonymous for the purposes of this class. It's a frame that helps you focus the complex nature of the world into bite-sized pieces that our little brains can comprehend, all right? And the act of framing The act of framing and frame analysis is to understand how others view the world. You're trying to understand the lens that others are using to view the same set of criterion or phenomena that you are, or even better, for yourself. And critical thinking starts with this, questioning what your frame is. And it's really hard to see one's frame. You can see other people's frame. You can see why the Democrats are wrong or the Republicans are wrong. Easy enough. But how about when it comes to yourself, right? And we've heard this term, perception as reality. That's what we're talking about. Seeing your frame is hard because it's like hearing your accent. It's what you grew up with. It's difficult and it's slightly unnatural and weird to try to tune out your and think about what your accent is. It's the same for framing. But we think in frames. We think with heuristics, right? So I'll try to give you a small example. One way we can do it is we're going to try to confuse your frame of reference. We're going to try to confuse with a psychological trip. We're going to try to confuse your first impression of a picture. Look at this picture and we'll see what your brain, we're going to try to short circuit your brain a bit. So look at this picture. Do you see a young woman or an old woman? Do you see both? Do you see neither? Which did you see first? Do you see a young woman or do you see an old woman? Well, what you see first, what you expect to see. And that's your frame. That's a bunch of heuristics serving you up. It's seeing a pattern of lines, things that you consciously don't think about. Babies think about this, and so do children as they're trying to develop their frame through normative learning and culturalization. But here we go. Here's your frame. What does your frame tell you about yourself? So for those, here's the young woman. She's facing away from us. Here are her eyes and nose. She's looking over her right shoulder. That's her ear. And that's her sort of chin line or jawbone, right? And she's looking over her right shoulder. There's also an old woman in this picture. This is the old woman's nose. She has a big nose. This is her eyeball. She's looking in front and down. And this is her mouth, right? So some of you may have experienced a moment of, that is weird. That is because we were trying to meddle with your frame of reference to unpack heuristics, right? Now here's a strategic failure alert, and it's really, really important. Can your frame be manipulated by other people, including, say, adversaries? Here's a very simple experiment about frame manipulation. The answer is yes. Frames can be manipulated to create what we call structured reality and purposeful deception, which is a strategy for war, which we will get to under, say, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. You can create structured realities and make pitfalls, strategic pitfalls for your enemies to fall into. You're basically manipulating their perception of reality. Okay, without them knowing about it. This is what advertising firms do all the time, and they make a lot of money, more than you and me. And look at what they're doing. So if you're selling gum, your brain is unconsciously associating gum with what you see on the screen. Or the Marlboro Man. Your brain is unconsciously associating those cigarettes with being, the Marlboro Man, this tough dude, right? Or Porsche with the white glove hands that showcase quality. That's a subliminal message. Or how about the ice? I don't know what this is, like some vodka drink of starting the party, being the life of the party. If you're holding this in your hand, if you're drinking their product, right? I mean, that is what advertising does. It messes subliminally with our perception of reality to make us buy things and want things that we may not naturally want or need. We also see versions of this, at least tactically. Operation Fortitude. These are military deception plans. During World War II, the Allies put General Patton in charge of a fake division, a fake army of inflatable tanks, to give the illusion to the Germans that General Patton would take his army and invade in Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy for Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944. Or we see it today, right? How did the Russians take the Crimea? Well, they used deception. They created a ghost occupation force using weapons that gave them good plausible deniability, like Spetsnaz special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, Little Green Men, these fake astroturfed proxy militias like the Donbass People's Militia, and loads of propaganda and active measures. They are creating a perception that does not reflect reality until it's too late. They erected the fog of war and stepped through it for victory. And only then did Western policymakers and analysts get it, until Crimea was a fait accompli, because they used strategic deception. And one of the questions I want you to think about in this course is the future of war more about strategic deception, or is it more about firepower and, steel on target? So as Obi-Wan would say, sort of putting some words in his mouth, is that you must train your mind to see your frame and the frame of your organization, your strategic culture, and only then can you differentiate perception for reality. If you could see your frame, you may not have been so easily duped by, say, Russian information operations, if you will. Or another way of putting it is, don't let people mess with your mind, right? All right, now let's go to another type of simple experiment. It's not military. We're sticking to simple, fun experiments about how people deliberately mess with your frame. They deliberately mess with it. Usually it's not pleasant. In this case, it is. So let's think about this and how they are deliberately tweaking your heuristics. They're deliberately manipulating your frame. One example is this.
First stage, you really blew my mind. Next stage, I reached but could not find. Blast off, exploding love. Cast off, blast off to the stars above. No relativity in my galaxy. Lift off for love. Lift off for love. Baby, hold on to me. Escape velocity. Lift off for love. Yeah. Lift off for love. Lift off for love. Lift off for love. Blast off.
Now, why were we fooled? Because they manipulated our frame. Our frame tells us people cannot be two places at once. They can't be alive and sawed in half, right? And under a magic trick, that's kind of funny, right? Now, how did they really do it? Well, let's reframe the situation and learn how they did it.
That's the way everyone else does it. This is the way we do it. We had to get these built special.
First day you slipped away from me. Next day you're not where you should be. Nah, nah, nah. Trapdoor hopped in for a while. Backdoor missed you by a mile. You look at me and laugh. I saw you in hell. Rip off the glove. Rip off the glove. Rip off the glove. Ain't no mystery. It's just trickery. Rip off the glove. Rip off the glove.
So here's what they did. They fooled you. Well, they fooled your frame, which fooled you. So when we, and this is, how magicians make their living. It's how ad people make their living. And when we see this in unexpected ways, if we're seeing something in real life, like in war, we don't want to be tricked this way, right? We don't want to see that. And when that happens, it sometimes leads to what we call cognitive dissonance. So when we see something unexpected happen with our frame, think of your frame as an iOS 14.0 or something like that. When something happens to it, it doesn't comprehend correctly. Sometimes it can cause an extreme conundrum that leaves us bewildered and perplexed, and even break down mentally. And this is cognitive dissonance is what happens when what we're seeing defies our frame. If what we're seeing literally is impossible for our mind, yet where our perceptions are sensing it, it's a fact, right? And the common responses to cognitive dissonance, one is laughter if you're at a magic show, but in real life, nobody wants this, right? The one is denial, and you hear this. People say, I can't believe this is happening. This can't be happening. Or during the Blitzkrieg, the French High Command, their leaders were incapable of thinking in terms of new war. Their minds were too inelastic. So one response is denial. And if people are in denial, that's a red flag to you that there's something wrong with your frame or the organization's frame. The other is to rationalize it. And here's an example of rationalization from one of my favorite comic strips, Dilbert, right? So rather than thinking about something rationally, they just bend their frame and they pretend things that are clearly irrational. They just say, poof, it's rational now. And I'm sure you've seen lots of examples of this. Perhaps some of you have had these types of discussions in American Thanksgivings with your families on different political parties. But these are two common responses to cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance at the strategic level, it's really bad if it happens to you, but it may be good if you're trying to impose that on your adversary. So the secret of good strategic thinking, again, is good critical thinking, because it prevents cognitive dissonance. You'd be less likely to be surprised if you're even aware that you have a frame. Think about people who are not even self-aware that they have a frame or a paradigm or whatever. So training your mind like a Jedi Master to see your frame so you can differentiate perception from reality. That is the key, or a big key, to quality strategic thinking. All right. So not letting people fool your frame. Now, what happens if there's something wrong with your frame itself, right? Nobody's manipulating, it's just something wrong with it. Well, we call this cognitive bias. This is bias, right? And we all have it. Nobody has perfect understanding of the world. Your mission this semester and this year is to understand what your weaknesses are. What are your most prevalent biases that get in the way of your strategic thinking? So cognitive bias, these are errors with our frame, we all have them, that cause us to misperceive reality. And this results in perception distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretations, and irrationality. Irrationality. And cognitive bias is a major reason why there is strategic failure. Have you ever seen wars where the weak inexplicably win against the strong? Well, often the strong has cognitive biases that they basically shoot themselves in the strategic foot, right? Often strong powers who ought to win sometimes lose, not because they get overpowered by the weaker power, which defies, comprehension. It's because they have cognitive biases. They impair their own strategic thinking, right? So here's a sort of an analogy to cognitive bias in action. And we call these types of things humorously the Darwin Awards in American society, American culture. And these are humorous awards. They're not about war, strategic thinking. They're just in general. The Darwin Awards come from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, of thinning out the gene pool of the weaker species, the weaker parts of the species to make the species stronger. And for humans, this means dumb people. And the idea is if you thin out dumb people, say a lion eating dumb people, then you make the herd stronger. It's obviously humorous, it's ironic, it's not serious, but it's a Darwin Award. And war has its fair share of Darwin Awards. I leave that to you to determine. But many Darwin Awards in the context of work stem from cognitive bias. This is a big feature for failure of strategy. Failures of strategic thinking comes down often to cognitive bias. Now, we could spend a whole semester on cognitive bias. Some of you intelligence analysts out there may already have done so. Cognitive bias is a big enemy of quality intelligence analysis and scholarship. Now, there are many types of cognitive bias. We are just going to focus on 7. We're going to look at the 7 most common cognitive biases. You can make it 12. We can spend all day on this. I'm just choosing 7. 7 that I want you to be intimately familiar with, that you can catch yourself and others so you don't fall into this trap. The first one, and the one that many of you know already, is called confirmation bias, where we love to agree with people who agree with us, right? Confirmation bias, this is how news organizations make money or take on lines, right? We have CNN generally leans towards the Democrats in the United States of America, whereas Fox leans towards the Republicans. And people, and if you look at their news, it's mostly opinion. It's an editorial opinion rather than raw news. It's a very heavy analysis, and CNN and Fox can take the same set of facts and derive completely different conclusions. And this is an example of confirmation bias, right? Now, in the context of national security, an example would be Curveball. Curveball was a source. He was an Iraqi exiled into Germany prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And he was a source who was promising that if Americans show up in Iraq, they'll be greeted like liberators in open arms, and Saddam Hussein would quickly fall. It would be very easy peasy. And of course, it was not. And confirmation bias, members of the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. policymaking community really privileged his message, even though it was mostly fallacious, privileged it over other intelligence because it conformed to what they wanted to be true. It was an example of confirmation bias, and it led to this idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and some of the greatest intelligence failures of the early 21st century, and great case studies for intelligence failures. Right, so confirmation bias is like curveball, which, by the way, the Germans rated as he said he was a garbage source and not credible, but Americans, intelligence community, and American policymakers, they inflated his reporting because they thought he conformed to what they wanted to be true. And this is similar to another type of bias called groupthink, herd mentality, where now we have, curveball out there. All the famous people in the intelligence community seem to think his information is the dope. It's really amazing. So I guess I should go along to get along. And this creates this idea of herd mentality, right? And we've seen this for intelligence failures. We've seen this in false strategies that if we just make, for example, Iraq a democracy, it'll spread democracy around the Middle East, and we all know democracies don't fight wars with each other because of democratic peace theory. These are all examples of wrong-headed theories that are propagated by herd mentality and some other biases. So an example of groupthink was the intelligence community in America and the White House saying, well, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Now, more groupthink than actual analysis. There was no data for that, no clear data for that, but that's what they went. It's what the U.S. administration went with, and the United States of America invaded a country looking for weapons of mass destruction where there were none. What kind of mistake is that? What's the moral calculus of that? I leave that to you. Another famous bias in the strategic community is mirror imaging or mirroring. This is the assumption that others think and act as we would. A good example would be the Maginot Line. The French generals in the 1920s and 30s, and André Maginot, the Minister of Defense for France, said, well, gee, if Germany was to attack France, how would they do it? And they just thought, like, well, how would we do it? And they'd say, well, we come through Alsace-Lorraine, as has always been the case for hundreds of years, so that's where we'll put up the Maginot Line. But that's not what happened. The Germans were not thinking that way. They were thinking differently. They were thinking, let's go through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, and then we'll hook around into France, right? So that's one example of mirroring. Another example of mirroring is during the Vietnam War. American generals assume they can bomb the North Vietnamese into submission, that after enough civilian casualties, that North Vietnam would say enough and capitulate. But that's not what happened. It turns out the threshold for North Vietnam's leadership of pain and casualties was much, much higher than General Westmoreland's assumption of it, much higher than the Americans doing the analysis. And that caused a lot of strategic problems for the Americans. A fourth type of bias is stereotyping, and you're all familiar with this, where socially constructed attributions of characteristics of people, we take a stereotype of a group and we assign it to an individual. So an example of this in the terms of warfare might be this: the British defeat at Yorktown after the American Revolutionary War. They, in some ways, did not assume that they could lose to the American rebels because they assumed that the American rebels were what they call rabble. Rabble's an older English word that just means sort of like a hodgepodge mob, or in the word, sort of stupid moron peasants. And as a result, Cornwallis strategically underestimated the American rebels and, lost in no small part to stereotyping what a professional soldier was to rabble. How do some leaders around the world today manipulate stereotypes for their own political gain, both domestic and international? Bias 5 is survivor's bias. And this is our sort of our tendency to want to focus on people who have been successful rather than focusing on people who've failed. right? So looking at like Fortune magazine, they have like, they ask like, a bunch of successful people, what was your secret to success? Maybe sometimes failure can teach us more than success, because sometimes people are more lucky than smart. And when failure becomes invisible, the difference between failure and success also becomes invisible. And we get quagmires like the Battle of Stalingrad or Verdun. Right? Sometimes it's better to study failure than success. But by ignoring failure, we become vulnerable to it. Bias 6 is anchoring, or anchoring bias. This is sometimes relying too heavily on the first piece of information that we see, or we anchor on that, right? So an example of this is a first impression during a job interview. This is why people like to dress up to leave a good first impression, because that in some ways, your potential boss is anchoring on what you look like. And a lot of what we look like, a lot of what we communicate comes from nonverbal communication in a job interview. But what we're wearing, our posture, our smile, all those things comes in before the first word comes out of our mouth. This is what, this is what people anchor upon. And you're trying to manipulate that by dressing well for a job interview. Right? In the first 90 seconds of a job interview, people make their mind up about a candidate often. So here's another, it's used as a sales trick, right? I mean, this is what retailers use all the time, or on Amazon, they use it all the time. They say, it's $95, that's the anchor. And then you say, ooh, $95, but I can get it for just $50. Ooh, that's a big value. Aha, woohoo. But that's wrong. It's a sales trick, right? It's a sales trick. And we've seen this in anchoring in intelligence and strategic thinking. So here is the day after 9/11, the 9/11 attack. This is Jim Woolsey, the former director of the CIA, the former DCI, on CNN, saying that only Iraq was probably behind the 9/11 attacks. And the reason he was doing that unconsciously is that he was anchoring that America was attacked on 9/11, and the last big, the last enemy that America faced was Iraq. So it must have been Iraq. That's his first impression. It was completely wrong. And this is a former head of the CIA who should know better. So if Jim Woolsey can make this mistake on CNN, you can too. So be careful of anchoring. The last bias we'll talk about is something called the dominant logic trap. This is literally where you are a paradigm prisoner of your own frame. You are trapped in, it's like you're in a cult. Your frame's a cult and you're trapped in it, right? So dominant logic is a term that comes from business theory, and it's similar to the idea of a frame or a paradigm or a worldview. It's the set of implicit and explicit assumptions, norms, and beliefs about how the world operates, right? It's like your frame. Now, in a business, business models reflect a company's dominant logic, how they plan to make money in a post-COVID world age. A new business model, that they have to have a new frame for that. And in terms of national security, grand strategy can also reflect a nation's dominant logic. Now, strategic culture, and this is key, strategic culture shapes and is shaped by the organization's dominant logic, right? Strategic culture is a shaper and is shaped by, dominant logic. One impacts the other. The dominant logic trap is that you will lose if your dominant logic does not evolve and adapt with the times. So think of Blockbuster Video. They thought the future was always going to be the DVD. They did not adapt to streaming, and they went out of business. Look at France after World War I. They thought the future of war would look like the last successful one, and then they lost in World War II in a matter of 46 days. They became paradigm prisoners of their frame. They fell into the dominant logic trap, and it was catastrophic for them. This is what Peter Drucker, the business expert, means when he says culture eats strategy for breakfast, is that people's culture can eclipse their strategic thinking, and this can lead to strategic catastrophe, bankruptcy if you're a corporation, or defeat in war if you're a nation state or a state. Now, there are examples of those who break through it, but again, they have Cassandra's curse. So you all hopefully remember the movie Moneyball. It's a kind of a cute movie based on a true story about Peter Brand and how to think about big league, strategy for baseball, right? And he comes out with a completely different approach, a completely different dominant logic that is in contravention of the reigning dominant logic of his day. And he's ridiculed by most everybody else in the industry, ridiculed. And you all know the Billy Mitchell story. He suffered the same fate. Those who can see through the dominant logic trap are often pilloried as kooks by those who are invested in it, right? They're either rationalizing it, they're denying it, or they're just rebuking it. Think of the Dilbert cartoon. So those are 7 common cognitive biases that often result in strategic failure. And if you're a weaker power taking on a stronger power, one thing that you could do strategically using your strategic thinking is figure out what bias or biases your adversary may fall prey to and doing everything you can to make them trip into that trap. Okay? So at the cognitive bias at the strategic level of war, it's shooting yourself in the foot. And if you're a strong power, how do you prevent this? You have to examine your frame and not take it for granted. Because if you just sort of sleepwalk into things, as the analogy goes, it leads to strategic surprise and even failure, as the Trojans will tell you. Or things like 9/11, the Blitzkrieg, Pearl Harbor. In all these cases, cognitive biases, lack of strategic thinking got in the way of victory. So I'll leave you this with our last strategic failure alert for the day is don't let this be you. Don't get caught on some beam or ladder somewhere searching desperately for, a way out for rescue because people didn't think through the situation using critical thinking and strategic thinking, which are one and the same. Now, for discussion, I want you to think about this, in addition to the questions in the syllabus. Can you think of an example where uncritical or non-strategic thinking, a formulaic approach to victory, tactical thinking at the strategic level, cognitive dissonance, or cognitive bias resulted in one of these? Bad assumptions, strategic surprise, started a quagmire of a war, prolonged a war, or strategic failure or defeat. Okay? Think about this. Think about where lack of strategic IQ resulted in strategic catastrophe. And think about what is strategic thinking vice other types of thinking. It's a specific type of thinking. It's not the best. There are many types of genius. It's one type of genius, but it happens to be the type of genius you will need to become a great strategic thinker. Thank you for that very much. And next time, we're going to look at more about strategy, grand strategy, what is victory, and what is war next time.